Okay, it's 2 o'clock, it's time. Then I'm going to go ahead while that wheel is spinning and hope it stops, and I'm going to get started with gratitude. Thank you so much for coming, everybody who's here in person, safely distanced apart. Thank you everybody who is logging on through YouTube and around wherever the world and the country. I appreciate you joining me today at the schoolhouse here in Skamokawa. Also gratitude to Friends of Skamokawa, the organization responsible for this wonderful place, and to the Willapa Hills Audubon chapter, local Willapa Hills Audubon chapter. And those are the two venerable sponsoring organizations. This is a fundraiser of this presentation. And so I will direct you to immediately a way that you can support both of them, and that is through their websites. They have donation buttons at willapahillsaudubon.org and friendsofskamokawa.org. And hopefully you know how to spell Skamokawa, but I'll spell it out later just in case. Anyway, I wanted to thank Steve Carson for doing all the tech, this really cool camera that I'm talking to right now, and microphone, all in one. I want one. And to Stacy Lane, thank you for, she's going to be moderating. So if you want to put comments into YouTube, wherever that is, Stacy will be monitoring questions and comments, and so we can make it interactive without being together in person. So anyway, this story actually started a long time ago when I was a kid. I had a lot of trouble and trauma early on in life, and my escape was to imagine myself journeying around the world by myself, just with my backpack, hiking, walking, and exploring the world. I was the George Bailey of Redwood City. I had the list of all the places in the world that I wanted to go, and I've actually gotten to see many of them. Not solo, not hiking, but necessarily. By the time I got into my late 20s, I looked at and considered doing the Pacific Crest Trail, but it's pretty busy. If you want to do a solo hike, you're not going to necessarily get that out of it. And so I kind of gave up on the idea until about 6 years ago. My farm mate, Ginny Callahan, and I were going to a paddle carving workshop that we did at our shop at Columbia River Kayaking. And the night before, I had a dream that I was kayaking and down this beautiful aquamarine waterway channel, and there were steep rock cliffs on the side covered with conifers. And I was paddling, and it was misty and romantic, and when I woke up, somehow I decided that was the Inside Passage. I'd never been there. I'd never been to Southeast Alaska or BC, but my subconscious told me that's where I was. And so I mentioned this in the truck ride over to the carving workshop to Ginny, and during the workshop, she took this picture of me carving my paddle, and she later that night posted it on Facebook and said, "Here is Kylene carving the paddle that she will use to paddle the Inside Passage." And I went, that's interesting. It didn't make me go, oh, that's what I'm going to do right away, but I thought it was interesting. So I started reading. Memoirs and biographies of people who had paddled some kind of vessel, self-propelled themselves in some kind of vessel in some part of the Inside Passage. And just learning, getting information. I browsed the web to look at photos and to look at the route. And for the first couple of years, that's all it was just thinking about it. And then I decided, yeah, I'm going to do something. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do something. And I would like to do it to celebrate my 50th birthday, which will be 4 years ago in a couple months. And so the initial goal was kind of loosely to do it in 2016. So I started looking and evaluating what I needed in order to do this. And so I started taking the training, which I needed to do anyway to be a kayak guide. I started looking at different kinds of gear, different kinds of boats, or kayaks, and decided that I wasn't going to make it in 2016, but that in 2018, by 2018, I wanted to be ready to do a test run or a shakedown. And so I decided to do that, and in 2018, I took a borrowed boat from NC Kayaks in Tacoma, who made my expedition boat. Travis, hi Travis, if you're out there. Travis actually lent me his model that was the same model as the one they were making for me to use for the shakedown. So I took that and all the gear and food that I could think of that would work with me, and did a 9-day test run up there the year before. And that helped me develop the final plan. It helped me, first of all, learn what I needed and what I didn't need, and what I brought and I still needed, and so forth. And it solidified my plan to go from, get my pointer going here, here we go, from Ketchikan here, down Revillagigedo Channel and around, and then to Prince Rupert, and then from Prince Rupert again on the inside, all the way down to cross at and over to Port Hardy on Vancouver Island, take the inside of Vancouver Island down and around, then through the San Juans over to Whidbey Island, around Whidbey, across from Whidbey over to Port Townsend, down the southern half of the Strait of San Juan de Fuca, making a left at Cape Flattery, continuing down the coast to the Columbia, make another left, and travel up the Columbia to Slowboat Farm. A distance of about 1,100 miles, give or take. And the reason for paddling north to south was several factors. One was that I had the window from June 1st to September 1st. That's the longest I could stay away from my company and have it stay alive, I thought, and it turned out to be right. Also, I read in a lot of memoirs that September 1st is when in Southeast Alaska and northward is when the storms start, reliably. And I felt that if I paddled north and I got delayed, let's say I got to as far as Prince Rupert by September 1st, I was going to be waiting out storms to make that last 100 miles to Ketchikan. Whereas if I went north to south and by September 1st I only make it to, say, Cape Flattery, well, September's the most beautiful time of year here. It's one of my two favorite months of the year to paddle here. It's calm, it's still warm, the lighting is incredible. So if I got stuck doing the coast in September, and it's close enough, I could still come home, work, and go up and finish those parts without having storms to dodge. So that was my reasoning for that. And so I had a couple of people organize a really lovely send-off party here. Thank you, Suzanne, if you're there, and Diane, if you're there. And we had a wonderful send-off party, and it was actually, the idea was from Steve Petticombe, the chair of the Willapa Hills Audubon. He's like, you need a send-off party. And it was nice the night before. Had everything packed in my car, on my car, had Babs the boat on top of the car, and 200 pounds of gear, and my uncle, that party. So we had a killer send-off party here. That's maybe not the best use of words, but anyway, thanks to Diane Stockhouse and Suzanne Holmes, we had a just wonderful, wonderful send-off party where I got to share the gear and the preparation. I mean, like the communication gear I did was like redundancy. I brought, this was like the best investment of all. It's a Garmin InReach Explorer, and it's GPS. You can text, you can email. It has an ePerb button on it, and it was always on me in one way or shape, at least when I was on the water. It was always right here. So I could always, and I could navigate. I had charts, I had paper charts, but sometimes they don't have it right. And, but sometimes neither does GPS. So almost always between the two, I could get where I wanted to go. But I had not only had that, I had my cell phone, and in a tight case. And I also invested, actually through some friends, bought for me a satellite hub, Wi-Fi hub. And in concept, it was great, and the ratings were great, and the recommendations were all great, but it didn't work for me in that part of the world very well. I think I got to use it once. But mercifully, I had great cell signal at certain points. So I blogged every day, and I journaled every day in my blog. And every 4 or 5 days, I'd have enough of a cell signal, I could upload my journals to my blog site. So I was able to communicate with people, let people know. They were able to make sure that I was safe and doing well. And I would at least send out, if I couldn't upload, I didn't have a cell signal, I'd send out at least one text, and that person could alert everybody that I was still alive. And anyway, so after the send-off party, I loaded up the car with or actually before the send-off party, with Babs the kayak, with all of my gear, 200 pounds of gear, and my uncle and I and my dog Gaston drove to Bellingham, and we met up with friends Carol and Corolla, who were Rhodes Scholars with Columbia River Kayaking. They live in Bellingham, and they served us a delightful lunch, and then I dropped off 2 food boxes, and Corolla, bless her heart, drove up over the Canadian border and mailed them to me at the points that I needed them. And then they also came with us and to send me off, I should say. There they are there with Gaston and me in the car and the boat and the gear and everything. And then I hugged my uncle goodbye, and I got on the ferry in Bellingham going up to Ketchikan, and had a 36-hour ride, which is always fabulous. Ferries, so one of the things I did in the planning is I was able to not be rigid about having to paddle every last mile. I was like, if I need help, if I'm tired, or if it's really crummy out for paddling, I'm not above getting a ride. And I love ferries. I would ride a ferry just for the purpose of riding one. So for my first ferry was the one on the Alaska Highway, and this is the view coming into Ketchikan, the ferry terminal at Ketchikan, after 36 hours, and after being blown around. It was a blustery ride. We went on the outside, which was really cool, because this ferry can. And I was really sad because on the Shakedown tour, I rode on the Columbia, was the name of the ferry that went between Bellingham and Ketchikan, and unfortunately they retired the Columbia just before this trip, and so I was on I can't remember now. But this one, the Columbia can't go on the outside, can only go on the inside. This one could go on the outside, it had the power and whatever to do that. So that was the nice trade-off. So I got to Ketchikan Ferry Terminal, walked my 200 pounds of gear, my 52-pound kayak, and myself over to the harbor to begin the first leg. From Ketchikan to, well, I ended up Foggy Bay. It was supposed to be Ketchikan to Prince Rupert. So here's Ketchikan, went in down Mabillado Channel, and then around down to, here's Foggy Bay. Prince Rupert's right over here. I could see Canada from where I was. And so I got everything to the harbor, got the kayak to the harbor, got it loaded up, and there she is, ready to go. And the cedar boughs I got from my good friend Dan Heiner to bless her with before the journey. And I set out. And so I'm going to just do highlights of this section, and I'll see if these actually play. So one of the things that I had consistently from the beginning, they're not working, for every single campsite or even people's homes that I was visiting, there were 2 birds that I heard every single time. One was this one, which is a Swainson's thrush, and I wish I could be playing either call, because it's really beautiful. It's like, you hear it, right now you can hear it all the time, everywhere around here. So they're here. The other is the Pacific wren, which also has a beautiful call. Which is there. The Pacific wren. It wasn't the same bird that was with me the whole time, just so we're clear. It's the same species of bird. I mean, I probably had some of the same ones in some of the just shorter runs, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, they were my constant companion. So it wasn't really solo, because I had these two birds in particular with me just everywhere that I went. And one night it was not so good because the Swainson's thrush started calling, and it was right over my head. And it didn't stop all night long. And by the morning, I was not thinking the Swainson's thrush was such a cool bird. But now we're there. Anyway, so I wanted to revisit two of my favorite beaches from the first, the Shakedown tour. And this was the first beach that I camped on. And it's a really good example of the beaches that I was on, because the tide change in that part is, I always thought we had a really huge tide change. We could get 12-foot tides here. And the average, I think the smallest tide change on my trip was 18 feet. And 26 was like common. And so oftentimes I'd have to hike up a quarter mile to get above the high tide line. And I'd have to find a beach that, first of all, had space enough above the high tide line to pitch my tent, and that wasn't hit with a wall of forest that was impenetrable. So, but this one was really nice. In fact, on the Shakedown, I was here for 2 days because I had some weather that I waited out, or 2 nights, I should say. And it's just really beautiful. I saw my first deer on it, and but this is just like a really good example of how far I had to go, because often I was putting in and taking out at low tide. Yeah, so it was get out, unload the 200 pounds of gear into 3 IKEA bags, and then hike the 3 IKEA bags up to the top, then come back, hoist the 52-pound kayak and walk that up, and then set up camp. So it was physically really demanding and wonderful. It was so wonderful. And I would say by maybe the 5th or 6th day, it was nothing. At first it was like, this is a good workout. And by then time it was just like, we'll just go down, get the kayak, get the bags, it was the really long ones. Anything longer than a quarter mile, then it was like the straps would dig into my shoulders of the IKEA bags. Anyway, this is really special. This was the second campsite, and it's in the back of it's still Revillagigedo Island where Ketchikan is, but it's at the pretty much close to the end where I left the island into the channel. And it's called Coho Cove, and it's a really deep cove. And it has forest, as you can see from it. It has a nice penetrable forest and mossy floor with spongy, so you don't even need a pad. And on the Shakedown tour, by the time I got to this, because this was like the 3rd night, I think, on the Shakedown, and those 3 days, even though I had my hair back, I braided, I put it in rubber bands, it would come out and it would get in my eyes and my nose and my mouth, and it was really annoying. And by the time I was packing up, I was coming out of my tent that morning to pack up and go. And I got out of my tent and I was closing the zipper, and a piece of my hair, a big chunk of my hair got caught in the zipper. And I just said, screw it. And I couldn't get it out. I couldn't get the zipper to move, so I just cut the chunk out. And then I proceeded to cut all of my hair off. My hair was really, really long at the time. And I cut it short enough that I didn't have to worry about it, and long enough that I could have it fixed in Ketchikan when I got back before I went and saw my aunt. And I took the hair that I had cut and I put it where my tent had been, in the center of that spot, and just like in a little nesting, and thought, I wonder if any of it will be here next year when I come back. And none of it was there, which to me means maybe it all got used by various other creatures. And then one of the things that I saw pretty much all the time on all the beaches were sea stars of different sizes and different shapes and different colors, all dog piled or sea star piled on rocks. And I just couldn't help always thinking, why can't we do that? You know? And this last highlight was I had one day on this stretch, one evening on this stretch, and enough dry wood that I had put away in a spot in a hatch that I could use this really cool cook stove that was lent to me by JD and Shira at Town of Taylor, because they had two when they met, so I got to borrow their extra. And the cool thing about this cook stove, it's a wood cook stove, is this little orange thing on the side is a convection device. And so once it hits a certain temperature, you turn that puppy on and you can charge all your electronic devices with a USB charger. So, and it actually charges pretty quickly, but after this point, it was like a couple of weeks before it was dry enough for me to use it again. But it was a highlight. And in this case, I was making a pot of chili. So I got down to Foggy Bay, and Foggy Bay is really, really big, and it has it has a couple of different large inlets and one small inlet. And so when I first got there, this is what it looked like. I got there during the day, and I went to the north end of it, because that's where I was going to launch from. The south end of it, because that's where I was going to launch from and continue south. And so this was my first beach, and there were bare paw prints on the beach when I got there, I noticed, and I was like, okay, well, here we go. And so that night, about 20 minutes before this photo was taken, I was standing there admiring the sunset at about 10 o'clock, and I see this dark shape, big, large dark shape, in the water, about right here, moving in this direction in a steady, slow, methodical way. Wow, that's really big. It's too big to be an elephant seal. Oh my gosh. And so I ran and grabbed my binoculars, because of course when this happens I don't have them on. And I looked through it, sure enough, it's got the nice big square face and the hump, and it was swimming, looking over at me, continuing to swim. It never changed its trajectory or its rate. It just kept going and kept looking over at me to make sure I wasn't changing anything. And I was just sitting there going, yes, yes. And it went out of sight. And after it went out of sight, then I did the happy dance. But I really wasn't scared. Once I saw that it didn't change anything, then I could just enjoy it. So that was my first grizzly bear in the wild that I got to see, and swimming. I mean, how cool is that? And so right that evening, of course, we got another low, or a low, the first low, big low, coming into Dixon Entrance. And I kept trying to nose out. I'd go out in the morning and try to nose out. I'd pack everything up, and it was just like Clopotis. It was just big waves and rainy and windy and not pleasant. And yeah, I could have paddled it. By that time, I had really gotten over most of my fear of big water and waves and wind, and I realized that I was not going to go over. And if I did go over, I had been practicing my roll with everything, all my gear, and I knew I could come back up. And even if I couldn't come back up, I had a paddle float that I could attach to my paddle and make it an outrigger and get back in that way if I needed. I mean, I had redundancy over redundancy in terms of safety and that, and I knew I could do it. And I was just like, but why? This isn't fun. This isn't going to be fun. I'm not going to be able to see as much. I'm going to be focusing on staying upright. And so I decided to come back. And after the third night, or on the third night, everything I had was wet, was soaking wet. My sleeping bag was wet. So I was sleeping in my hydroskins, in my dry suit, with my storm cag on, all of these layers in my sleeping bag. And it wasn't that cold, but it was so wet. And everything started to shrivel and was constantly pruny. And I was just like, okay, I give. And I look at my phone and I have a cell signal. So I called my friend Connie in Portland. If you're there, hi Connie. And she did some research, and she said, maybe we could find a water taxi, because I'm like, can we find somebody who can give me a ride? And I had moved over to a beach on the north end of Foggy Bay so that I had read in Jennifer Hahn's book, I had read that cruisers and people sailing and whatnot like to go into the inlet. That's the very inlet. It's called Very Inlet. They like to go into that inlet to get out of the storm, but then they'll still sail out in the storm or cruise out in the storm and go on to Prince Rupert. So I thought, I'll go over there in case I see somebody, maybe I can get a ride. And so I went to this new beach, and I took this picture of this dragonfly carapace, which I thought was really cool picture. With the rock line behind it, it looks like it's like spitting or something. And so I spent one night, I think, in that, and I managed to find some new friends in Metlakatla, which is the only reservation in Alaska, the state of Alaska. And it's on Annette Island. It's just out of Ketchikan. And the fire chief and there's a fire chief, and they were both the fire people. And they actually brought the search and rescue boat down, because they can, for non-rescues, or at least rescuing soggy kayakers, down to the bay and picked me up. And when they got there, we loaded Babs up and we loaded my gear up, and as I'm climbing up to the boat, they said, on the other side of the point, there's a bear. And I was like, wow, cool, let's go see it. And so imagine this is the point, and the point is actually maybe 20 feet wide. I didn't know this because I went to this side of the point, and I was kind of toward the end of the point. And so we went out around the bay and over to the other side of the point, and there was this guy foraging through the driftwood for grubs or whatever, and very active. I think probably maybe a 2-year-old male. And he looked at us, he saw us, he knew we were there, and they tried to go back to work and then look and see that we were still there, and he was just kind of like annoyed. And after 5 minutes of us, taking pictures and videos and just going, this is so cool, he was like, they're not going to go away. And so he turned around and he walked back into these trees, which are literally about 10 feet from where my tent was. Whoa. So I probably slept with this bear. Sleeping with bears. So I did punt. They took me back up, and I took the ferry to Prince Rupert. So I got a second ferry ride, which was really cool. Actually, I had 3, because they took me to Annette Island, and there's a ferry that goes from Annette Island over to Ketchikan, and then I took the ferry from Ketchikan down to Prince Rupert. So I really only had 30 miles left before I was at Prince Rupert, but I got a really great ferry ride out of it. This is the picture coming into Prince Rupert. It was a beautiful, beautiful, clear, sunny day. But by that time, I'd gotten everything dried out, and I did have some repairs that I needed to do. So I spent a day or 2 in Prince Rupert, treating my sleeping bag with rain guard and my tent with more rain guard, and getting ready for more wet, because there was more wet to come. But after that point, I was dry for the most part. So the next segment was from Prince Rupert to Port Hardy. So here's Prince Rupert up here, and it's on Kayan Island. And we came in on the ferry on the north end of Prince Rupert. It's on the north side. And so when I paddled, I actually kept going around Kayan Island, around to the south side, around Port Edward, which is a cool little industrial town, and then took Grenville Channel, which is this long, narrow channel here, down around this section here, McKay Reach, and then down into Princess Royal Channel. So I was still all on the inside here, and then ultimately down to Klemtu, which is the nation. So that was my route, and then ultimately I was planning on taking that down inside to Bella Bella, inside down to cross over here to Port Hardy on Vancouver Island. And at Port Edward, did not show on the any charts or any GPS that just north of the town are Whitewater Rapids. So Babs got to do Whitewater Rapids. She did great, but I could hear them when I was coming around the curve. It was really kind of like a blank spot, because they were man-made. And I could hear it. And I was like, that sounds like at least a 2-star rapid. And there was nowhere to get out to see them. And I'm like, well, I would think that there would be something if these were really bad. And they rapids themselves weren't bad, but the eddies were huge. They were just, I mean, I took everything I had to brace and not get just like totally spun around in these things. And I made it through and got around the island. It was beautiful, and to the southern, basically, tip. To continue on, and this is the view out of the lighthouse at the end of Can Island. So I made a left at the lighthouse, and then this was my first beach that I camped on after leaving Prince Rupert, and I just thought it was so nice to have it not actually pouring rain. It was just cloudy and drizzly. And these are some highlights that I started to getting into Grenville Channel. This club moss was actually in a campsite that I still can't find a field guide to ID. So if anybody out there has seen red, bright, brilliant, beautiful red club moss that they know what that's called, send it in to Stacy. And then I started to see, I started to see waterfalls, more and more waterfalls. And then this was, I think, the third night out of Prince Rupert, the beach. And what was special about this was it was my first sighting of a river otter on my trip. And he kind of hung out with me for quite a while. And then this is my entrance actually into Grenville Channel proper. And Grenville Channel was my favorite part of this trip, this whole journey. It was beautiful. It's a very narrow channel, very long. I had read books that said that finding beach campsites was really hard. I never had a problem. I was on both sides, going over, and I had my pick, and I always had really nice campsites. Saw more and more waterfalls, and started to have more sunny days. And I saw what I saw in my dream 6 years ago, and this is it. So it's when I got there, I was like, okay, well, there's something. So after I got out of Grenville Channel, which is here, and I got into this McKay Reach area, it was big. It was the biggest water I'd had so far. And because you have all of these different reaches and inlets coming in at the same time, and tide changes, everything, it was really big. So I took a really quick turn into a smaller channel, more protected channel, and tucked into Hartley Bay, which is a First Nations village. It's the Gitga'ata, there we go, Gitga'ata. They're part of the Tsimshian nation. And they were so nice. I saw a fisherman when I was coming in small little tiny boats, and I'm like, I know I've got to be close, because they wouldn't be this far out if I wasn't close. And they helped me, direct me to the village. And I got to the village and asked for permission to take out there, and they're like, absolutely. And I'm like, could I camp here? And they're like, camp anywhere you want. And then when I was getting out and unloading, a gentleman came by and said, our longhouse has a patio behind it, a covered patio behind it. You're welcome to set up your tent back there and get out of the rain, which I did. It was great. And so the next morning I was loading up, and my plan was to actually come back down and go down the south end of Gribel Island and then over to Princess Royal Channel here. And while I was packing up the following morning, I met my first Royal Mountie, Coast Guard Royal Mountie. They're still Mounties, aren't they? Anyway, and he was asking about my trip, and he said, well, you know, there's hot springs on the other side of Gribel Island. I was like, hot springs? After 5 weeks of sogginess, hot springs sound great. And he said, before the hot springs, though, there's this cabin. And but you have to go up around the north side of Gribel, and then the cabin's like right over here, and the hot springs are then down here. And I thought, well, I can do that. I can go around the island the other way. Mileage-wise, it actually wasn't that much more, because it's narrow and pointy on the top, and it's wide and long on the bottom. So So I put on the water, and the whole time, all the things seeing, I was just dreaming of a cabin. He said it's a big cabin, and I could take all my gear and dry it out again, run around naked if I wanted, and I was all excited and having these visions. And I pull up to the cabin, and I see an adult-sized person and two small-sized people that look like they are just just getting off the water. They didn't look like they were loading up. And they were in a raft, a river raft, a frame boat river raft with an outboard motor on it. And I'm like, this is interesting. Well, just in case they're packing up, but they don't look like it, I'm gonna go in. And it was a man and his two young sons. And he said, the cabin's really big. We can make this work. And I was like, well, not exactly how I had in mind, but okay, we'll see. So I went and looked, and the cabin was really large, and these two boys were just so cute. And the cool story about that is, so a friend of mine, Audrey's husband, Andrew, lent me a book as I was planning for the trip. And it was a book written by a woman who had many children, and she lived on Vancouver Island, and they would follow in the summers. They would follow in the footsteps of Vancouver, and they were in all sorts of danger. And it was a wonderful book. And as we're going to sleep, there were two sets of bunk beds. The dad and the two kids were on the lower bunk bed here, and I was on the upper bunk bed here, and he starts reading a chapter in that book to them. And it was the chapter I liked the best about a bear experience with the mom, and her kids were playing on the beach. She was up getting some fish up in the stream, and she just had this feeling. And she went down, and there was a bear just standing at the edge of the beach watching her children play. But the fact that he was reading that, I was just like, this is really, really cool. So the next morning, I was going to the hot springs and realized that this raft, so he was from Colorado, and they river raft the Colorado River, and his dream, kind of like mine, was to put in the Skeena River, and then take it down, and then go hot springs around the area. And this was his shakedown trip. So, and one of the things he learned is that he has a lot longer to wait for high tide before he can take that raft in and out of beaches. But I, on the other hand, with kayak, could pretty much launch on any tide. So I took off, and but some pictures of Grabelle Island that I would like to share. This was a really beautiful, big waterfall, and there were many of them. And then I couldn't get a really decent picture, but there's actually a face in this rock. If you look at it, you've got a couple eyes, a nose, and a mouth. But what was remarkable about this, it's really, really high. And this was the first time I could really feel and see the glacial impact, that this was carved by glaciers, because there's just this rock face that was carved. And that's what I was trying to capture along with the face in that. And then the coloring of the rocks along the shore, and this is, look at the color of the water, it's just striking. But it looked, first I thought it was petroglyphs. And that's what it looks like up close. But talk about somebody's got an eye. Anyway, so I paddled I think it took me an hour to get from the cabin down to Bishop Bay, Monkey Beach Conservancy, or Bishop Hot Springs. And when I pulled in, there's a float with a little tiny mobile home kind of thing on it, and a little tiny tug that had pulled it in. And a construction crew, they were improving the trails and stuff at the hot springs. And they had it all set up. They had a campfire, and they're like, yeah, we'll make it. And they made me a spot right there out at the edge of the float so I could put my tent and I could have a view of the bay. And then they fed me. And then the owner dove after they got done working for the day. He likes to dive, and he went down below, and he brought up some cool things. Like, this is the largest sea cucumber I've seen. The thing was like this long. And he kept telling me that and I don't think he wasn't pulling my leg because I've verified it, that they taste like bacon. If you cook them up, they taste like bacon. And I was holding it, and I'm like, so how do I kill it? And he says, you can't kill it. It's not alive. And I'm like, but it is. It's moving. It's alive. And he's like, I was like, where's the head? He's like, there is no head. And I just couldn't figure, since I couldn't get my mind around it, I put it back in the water. And the other thing, so I'll save that for another trip. So the other thing that he brought out was this nudibranch, which I have never seen before. It's a sea slug. And he said this was one of the largest ones he'd ever seen before. And I thought it was pretty cool. And then, of course, I got to go in the hot springs. And I went in many, many times that day and the next morning. And the guy and the two kids did show up a few hours later, and the owner of the construction company taught the kids how to fish off of the dock, and they were catching some nice sized fish. And so the next morning they all cooked up the fish, and I didn't have to catch it. I didn't have to prepare it. So the next day after this, I paddled from Bishop Bay south down past McKay Reach and down Princess Royal Channel. And I didn't have a destination in place, but this is where I realized how good I am at tidal planning and navigation. One of the goals of this and the intents of this trip was to learn about myself. And I went into this with a lot of fear, and I went in with a lot of self-doubt. And I learned that I can make quick decisions, good quick decisions, regularly. And I also learned that I can take, despite the fact that I'm dyslexic, I can look at tides and charts and currents, and I can read the water. And so I got really good at doing long paddles in a short period of time because I had the current with me. And when you've got a 26-foot tide change, you're screaming. I mean, I was to the point where I was averaging 5 miles an hour. And before this, 5.5 was my peak. If I was sprinting, I could do it for a short period of time. But it was just, I was paddling just normally, and I was doing 5 miles an hour, averaging. This next day was my longest day, and it was 27.6 miles, which I did in 5 hours. And got to the town of Buttedale. This is the view from where I stayed in Buttedale, which was in a house. Buttedale was a mill town in the early 20th century, and has been a ghost town since then. It has a beautiful, beautiful waterfall, which I could not get a good picture of. Anyway, it has a caretaker, and they're actually working a program to turn it into a resort, to just upgrade it and make it this resort place that you can only get to by water. And it should be really nice for that, and it'll be neat to have people there again. But it was cool. The day I got there, the caretaker told me that there was a spirit bearer right in this spot, right here, taking a nap and watching them down at the dock cleaning fish the day before I got there. So I did not get to see a spirit bear, which are the albino brown bears, in case you don't know that. And not brown bears, black bears, sorry, albino black bears. They are black bears they're not grizzlies. A lot of people, I thought before I did the trip that they were grizzlies, but they're not. They're big. But anyway, so I didn't get to see it. I did get to see the scat. Anyway, he says, would you like to be a guest here? And I said, yes. And he said, okay, here's your card. He made me a special card, which I still have. It says I was a guest of Buttedale. Showed me to the house, which had a stove in it with propane that he turned on, and had a bed. I could put my sleeping bag on, and it was really nice. I was in a house. And so I had a lovely night. And then there were 2 yachts that were parked there, and one of the couples they weren't a couple, they were friends. He was dropping her off. They were on their way for him dropping her off, and they invited me for supper. So I had this wonderful supper, warm, hot supper, not rehydrated food. And slept like a baby, and took off the next day toward the town of Klemtu. And as I took off and I launched, I got this picture. I saw mostly gray whales. I did see 5 species of whale on the trip, but I saw one humpback in the very beginning, and then after that it was all grays until I got to pretty much to Vancouver Island. And then I started seeing the orcas, and I saw minke, and let's see, I got 5. What's the 5th one? What am I forgetting? Anyway. So yeah, and these guys were close and with me a lot of the way. My favorite story was, so yachts. I developed a love-hate relationship with yachts on this trip and the other trip, because by and large they like to have the biggest spray coming out that is possible, because it looks so magnificent, this boat coming with this just beautiful spray. And if they're long ass keels, they make the worst wakes ever. They have more of a wake than cruise ships make. And they don't care. And they don't see you, and if they do see you, they don't care. By and large, not everybody, I'm not putting them all there, because especially the yachters that were my hosts, I went on a little bit of a tirade about, because the day before, 2 days before, something like that, there was one coming down, and it was the biggest one I had seen, and it stopped. And I'm like, why did it stop? And then I remembered there were a few gray whales out in the channel, and they have to stop. They cannot keep going. They can't move toward them. And at first I'm like, it stopped for me? Wow. Okay, maybe it's not so bad. And then I get closer to it, and I see this very tan, glistening guy with the jewelry just looking out on the bow, going like this. And there's like a captain-looking guy talking to him, like going, I can't do anything about this. And I'm just like, really? You're upset that you had to stop for whales? So I was telling them the story, and they're like, we hadn't thought about that, about stopping our wakes and the impact it has for kayaks. We're going to be more thoughtful in the future. And I was like, I got one. But anyway, the whales really were in Princess Royal Channel abundantly. The gray whales, I should say, were. And I had fairly smooth paddle down Princess Royal Channel to the town of Klemtu. This is their longhouse. And they're part of the Kitasoo tribe, which is also the Tsimshian nation. And the only downside to Princess Royal Channel paddle and the days leading up to that was that it was warmer, drier, hotter, and I started getting chafing under my arms. And, because you're doing this. And by the time I got to Klemtu, I had open wounds under my arms, and it hurt to just be. And Babs had some pretty big chafing too from being pulled up onto rocky, full of sharp thing beaches for a month and a half. And so, actually no, a month, 5 weeks. And so I had some serious repairs to do with her. So we discovered the Great Bear Spirit Lodge, which is a lodge in Klemtu that it's modern, it's beautiful, it's simple, it's elegant. They do a lot like Columbia River Kayaking does. They do programs that are educational. They take people out in motorboats, and they take them to places where they can go see spirit bears, hopefully, or they can at least see grizzlies, or they can see black bears, or all of the above, or they can see marine life, and they can kayak, and they can hike, and they're just a wonderful organization. If you ever want to go visit them, I highly recommend it. And I talked with the director there, and I told them my story, and they were so welcoming, and they gave me a room. They didn't give it to me, but they gave it to me at a nice, affordable price. And I had a nice, luxurious place to heal and get to where I could paddle again without pain and fix Babs and explore. This is the first time I actually could stop somewhere and explore. And what better place to explore than this lovely village that's on this point. It actually had a ferry terminal for the smaller ferries, for the BC ferries. And they had lots of great wildlife. They had a lake up above their reservoir. And they made all of their own fresh food from organic, locally sourced ingredients when possible that I had to eat while I was there. And they let me join their activities. So if I wanted to, I didn't have to, and they were going to do something, I could join in. And I did traipse about the town and see they had a lot of crows. But it's a really charming little town. And this is how I knew that it was 222 kilometers, which I think was like 150 miles to Port Hardy from there. And that was the same distance as if I had gone through. Anyway, I got to see my first doll porpoises from the boat. And I don't know if you've ever seen doll porpoises, but they love speedboats. They love wakes. They came for probably 10, 15 minutes and played and cycled through and came through again, diving through the wakes. They were so fun. Fastest marine mammal on Earth. Don't tell the orcas, because they don't believe it. Also got to go see this large group of stellar sea lions, and the bulls were easily 1,000 pounds. Gorgeous sea lions. And this is BC's Price Island. We have our Price Island right out here. This is Price Island in British Columbia. So I did decide to, on the advice of a couple of people there, on my last day, they said, go see the lake, hike up to the lake, grab a paddle. There are a couple canoes up there, and you can paddle around. And so grabbed my travel guitar, which went with me, and I grabbed a canoe paddle and hiked up. On the way up, I got lost, and I got into the middle of the creek, and I hear a very familiar sound of this little guy. That's an American dipper, but since it was in Canada, is it a Canadian American dipper? Audubon people, what do you think? Let Stacy know. Anyway, so I got to see it just all over, and I was just like, I was so tickled, because the dipper's kind of my spirit bird. Not my totem animal, it's my spirit bird. Anyway, so I did get to, and I felt so inspired when I got up to the top that I wrote a song, and I'm going to play it for y'all now. Well, I'm picking up my paddle, jumping in the canoe, paddling out to the middle of the lake to write a song about you. It's been really hard being away all this time. Been so understanding while I shift my paradigm. What I miss about you most is you're always by my side. Your unconditional love and the friendship you provide. Well, I'm picking up my paddle, jumping in the canoe, paddling out to the middle of the lake to write a song about you. Go away to find out what I'm made of. You understood more than I need to face what I'm afraid of. I know it's hard for you without me, but you never hold a grudge. When I get home you're glad to see me, and you never ever judge. Well, I'm picking up my paddle, jumping in the canoe, and paddling out to the middle of the lake to write a song about you. So walking back down from the lake, I made a new friend. So Mink was following me on the road. It wasn't like really happy to be walking next to me, but it was nice of it to get so close that I could get an action shot. But I saw a lot of these. I saw a lot of these on the beaches, up in the rocks along right near the water. I would see them in the mornings. And I never had a problem with any of them like trying to get to my food. Or that was one thing that, you know, I had friends who, I know one of them's watching, was really nervous about the whole food thing in bears. And I brought, in fact, she bought me a carbon like storage bag. And that was the one that I would have out, or, you know, or was more exposed. The other ones, the other parts of the food, I kept in dry bags. They're dry bags. They're airtight. They're watertight, so they're airtight. And I used them as pillows. So that's, you know, I did a lot of research. I did a lot of research on people that do the popular hiking trails. And if I had been going places where a lot of people are, and so the wildlife gets used to them and knows that they can get stuff, then I would have done it differently. But the numbers of people who injured themselves severely by trying to find a branch and tossing the bag over it, and, you know, ended up giving themselves, what are those called? Concussions, thank you. I started thinking, you know, that is exactly the kind of thing I would end up doing. So I found one guy who has spent like 30, 40 years hiking the Pacific Crest, Adirondack. I mean, all of these busy trails, and that's what he does. He gets the waterproof bags, and they're not necessarily kayak bags, but they're made, I think, for food. But they're still the same thing. They're PVC, or not PVC, but Tyvek or whatever, plastic, rubber, whatever, and they seal up. They roll and they seal up, and that's what he does. Is he sleeps with them in his tent, and never had any issues, not with any kind of rodents or anybody with the food, except some of my food bags, and these are the ones that are made for it, or clear. And this was on the shakedown trip. I had the quarter-mile haul, and I didn't have the 3 IKEA bags yet. I didn't realize, that was when I realized I needed them, with zippers that you can close up. So they were just in IKEA bags that were open, and it was in the top of it. And I think the Salisbury steak dehydrated food was inside the clear bag. And of course I had to stage. I couldn't take everything down at once. So I left the bag there 300 feet from where I went out to the boat to take the other bag. And by the time I got back, a northwestern crow had pecked through the plastic into the bag and was eating the Salisbury steak. That is the only animal thing that I had a problem with, and so I rolled it against them. They're smart. They're really smart. So because I spent the time that I did, and I don't regret it at all. And because I did get to go on the activity with them, down where I saw the Steller sea lions and I saw the doll porpoises, we went to Bella Bella, which was going to be one of my stopping points anyway. It would have been the last major town before I did the last leg over to Vancouver Island to Port Hardy. But because I had gotten to do that route, and they went the route that I would have taken in a kayak, I took the ferry from a BC ferry. Oh my gosh, take BC ferries. They are so nice. And instead of like the Alaska State Ferry, if there's an announcement, it goes, this really loud thing, and then now you can go down to the car deck. BC Ferry is like this, doom, doom, doom. You may now go down to the car deck. It's like, wow, okay, we need to take a page out of that book. But anyway, they're beautiful, beautiful ferries. So I was really glad I took that over to Port Hardy just before 4th of July. I think it was the 3rd of July that I took that over to Vancouver Island. So here is here's Port Hardy. So the ferry came down here and up into Port Hardy. And there I was met by my ground crew, my midterm ground crew, consisting of Gaston, complete with, I think he had balloons on him or something like that when he picked me up at the ferry terminal late that night. And so my uncle and dog and my car, my very low Saab car, low to the ground, picked me up, and we spent the night in Port Hardy. And then I reassembled some food and packed up, and then we camped. We started camping and spent 4th of July. Here's Uncle Sidney with his fireworks. So he came prepared, and I took off out of Port Hardy. This is the view out of Port Hardy. It was actually a really pretty paddle. Slightly textured water, but it calmed down over the day, and I went past Alert Bay, which this is the town of Alert Bay here, and I'd had a kayaking client that was from Alert Bay, and I recognized the name, and it is a pretty little town. It's someone I want to go back to. I could see myself living there when I retire, when I'm 90. Anyway, so then I proceeded to be able to paddle during the day, and we could find a place where they could drive to and meet me, and we could camp every night, all the way down to Seymour Narrows, which is south of the middle. No, north of the middle, just north of the middle. Past Johntown Strait, the infamous Johntown Strait, which I only had one day in Johntown Strait that was challenging. It was only a 23-mile paddle, which by that time for me was only a 23-mile paddle, but it had some current influences that I could not figure out, and it was a slog. It took me 8.5 hours to do that paddle. So, and yeah, I was tired. I was really tired. And they were waiting for me at the pier, and he'd notified everybody. They were like, what are you waiting for? I'm waiting for my niece. And so when I got there, everybody in the campground was like, yay! And they even let him use their Wi-Fi, which they didn't let clients use because they wanted to make sure that we could connect. Have friends childhood friend that lives on Quadra Island, and they connected us. And I went paddle to, they're actually about right here on Quadra Island. Quadra Island is gorgeous. It's got a great population of folks, and Jim and Maria, I paddled right up to their beach. All right.
Welcome
and so Bob and Melissa, if you're here, hi. I'm on to Jim and Maria on Quadra Island, and Jim is a sculptor, and he's into this thing called intuitive listening, that he's created this concept. And on one of the beaches on Quadra Island is driftwood that's all the way to the edge of the beach. I mean, we're talking maybe a total of 1 square mile of driftwood, just full of driftwood. And he was walking along, and he found this big, huge log, and he said, that's the log I want to carve. And it took him 6 months or so before he had, somebody had a crane that could come out and get that log. But he just waited. And they took it and took it back to his house, and he just started working on it. And he got to a certain point where it was, fairly well shaped. He's got marine life coming out of it in different places. And then he thought, I need to do something more with it, but I don't know what that is. And so he left it, walked away from it, slept on it, woke up the next morning, he says, completely on autopilot. He wasn't even thinking. I mean, he had his coffee, and they drink coffee in the morning. And went down to the sculpture, grabbed a chainsaw, and just started cutting this hole out in the middle of it. Got done with that, shaped that, sanded that, finished that. Got done with it, and he went over to, after that, he went over to see a friend, and he was in the friend's garage, and the friend he's a beachcomber, so he collects different things from the beach. And up on the shelf in his garage was this bone that was exactly the same shape as the sculpture. And he asked his friend what it was, and he said, it's the inner ear bone of a whale. So he had carved the inner ear bone of a whale, not knowing what it looked like, out of this piece of wood, out of thousands of pieces of wood. And here he is inside the sculpture. And when you get in it, you can hear it. And so, of course, at the moment that he holds it, he hands me, so I'm standing in front of this, basically. This is before he got in it. And he's telling me the story, and he hands me the whalebone. And in such a way that I'm looking at the whalebone, and I'm looking at the sculpture, and I'm holding this whale's inner ear bone, and I lost my stuff. I was just sobbing. I was just like, oh my God, this is incredible. It was such a moving thing for me, and a total highlight of the experience. And another great part of it is that he had some friends that were visiting from Vancouver Island, a man and his 2 grandsons. And of course, Jim was teaching one of the grandsons how to fish also, and he was catching fish. It was the older grandson, and his name is Sam. And there's Sam with his catch. And Sam taught me how to use Instagram. Hi, Sam, if you're out there. And then as I paddled south past Campbell River to past their beach, I got to stay with them for a night and see them again. And Sam greeted me at the beach when I paddled up to it. And Sam has taken an interest in kayaking. And he's actually maybe going to work this summer at the local kayak shop. So glad to know that this, and all I had to do, well, first of all, he's a ballet dancer and is an athlete, and so I was showing him how to use your core with the paddle, and the minute he started, he was perfect, and I was like, you're going to be just fine, kid. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad that just that little bit gave him an interest in it. And then what's really special about Sam, though, is as I was, they all helped me load my boat, or launch my boat. I was ready to get on the water, and Sam had walked over, 30 feet away, and he comes back with a sea urchin, a fresh sea urchin, freshly dead sea urchin. And on this trip, I had wanted sea urchin. It's my favorite sashimi. I love sea urchin. I could live on sea urchin. I wanted to live on sea urchin on this trip. And the one time in Johntown Strait where I came next to a rock bank, and the water was so clear I could see, all the way down. And in it are all of these red, purpley pockets. And I so wanted to grab one of them. So I'm trying to paddle up to him, trying to, get down and reach down and get one, but I keep getting pushed back. And this was that day on Johntown Strait when I had all the weird currents. And I was so engrossed in getting the urchin that I hadn't looked over the other side of me, and it's just whoosh, whoosh, and there's eddies, and I'm going, okay, maybe I need to focus a little bit more on safety here first, and gotta let the sea urchin go. So they got a pass that day. It was really disappointing because that was going to be my moment when I had my sea urchin. I took it up on the beach and did my little ceremony and then cracked it open and ate it. So he brought me a sea urchin. So he gets the memory for that. And before I launched it, I cracked it open and I ate the roe and took off. And the next location that was of note was just north of Nanaimo, Southie Island. And this was the first place where I could forage for a whole salad. It had everything I needed for a whole salad. And I spent 2 nights there. And then paddled to Nanaimo from there, got stuck in Nanaimo because the winds were just crazy. And ended up punting again and just looking at, because of course I had a full cell signal in Nanaimo, and found a kayak company just like ours in Maple Bay, pretty far south of Nanaimo, I think about 50 miles south. And talked to the owner. Her name's Nancy. She's my new good friend. And not so new, it's like been a year now almost. Hi, Nancy, if you're here. And she was busy. She had a group that day, so she couldn't come get me, but she said, contact the Nanaimo Paddling Club. And I did. And this very, very nice guy named Rod, hi Rod if you're here, he came and got me. He, of course, he's a kayaker, so he had the trailer, he had all the straps and everything, and he drove me down south toward Maple Bay. And so it's across from Salt Spring Island, if any of you are aware of Salt Spring Island. And I launched from there so that I could go down the peninsula, Victoria Peninsula, there we go. And Nancy helped me figure out that I didn't want to have to paddle all the way around it and then back up into the San Juans. So I got to paddle down to the one side, and then she picked me up and then drove me across the peninsula so I could launch from the eastern side of it. But here's just some wild onion that I was able to forage. Here's my tent on Southie Island, my campsite. It was gorgeous. God, it was so nice. So this is Vancouver Island to Orcas Island, and it was a 24-mile paddle that I did from Sydney, north of Victoria, from the Royal Yacht Club, where they let me stay. Nancy helped me talk them into letting me camp there. So I launched from there. They were so nice. In fact, the guy who was there, who was on the board, but he's not like the president or anything. In fact, he's not the president because he's a bit of a rebel. He said, you know what? I'm going to give you permission to stay here. And he wrote it all out on a card, and he said, if they have a problem with that, they can take it up with me. He was really nice. But they didn't have a problem. I got to use their laundry facilities and ordered Thai delivery. And then had a nice paddle from Vancouver to Orcas. And July in the San Juans in the water is crazy full of, well, maybe not now, but it was last year, full of motorboats coming from every direction. A lot of them were tour boats out to see whales. And so I came up on this group, and I'm like, there are all of these boats where the people in them look like Legos. And because they're like rows, and the people all look the same. They have like their same jackets on and the same hats and everything. And I'm just like, what is going on? And they're all stopped in this one spot. And then there was this one smaller boat with just 3 women on it that looked like me. And so I'm like, what's going on? Is there something happening? And she's like, there's a pot of orcas over there. And that's when I saw the pot of orcas, and everybody's seeing it. And what these gals' job was to monitor and make sure everybody behaved themselves, all the humans behaved themselves. And so they were in charge. And so I got to see the pot of orcas, and then the minute the orcas were gone, all the people were gone, but then there were still boats coming in every direction, and it scared the heck out of me. And it was just like, oh, I got to get out of this like super highway of all these vessels that, I mean, because there was at one point I had 5 coming from every direction, and I'm like, which direction do I go? I mean, any way I go, I'm going toward one of these boats. Are they going to see me? And they all did, and I made it to, this is one of the cool shots of the man of war that I saw. And then I saw, as I came around Orcas, I saw this group of kayaks with people in doubles, and one person in their own single boat kind of doing this like light paddle, because if you stop paddling, they stop paddling. So if you're a kayak guide, so I knew that was the guide. Because they're all like la 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 la, and this guy's like yeah, da, 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 da. And so I just snuck in to the group, and I was next to two gals in one of the boats, and I'm like, how you doing today? And actually the same color as Babs, the top was the same color. I kind of see that in the picture, that they had the same color. This is the guide here. And I'm like, shh, let's see how long it takes him to notice he has another customer. And it took him 30 seconds, I think, before he just smiles and he says, hello, welcome. So paddled back in, and that's where I met up with my ground crew again. And we stayed and had a beer with the guides and in Deer Harbor. And then stayed with Cousin Roger for a couple of nights. And then we drove over to Whidbey because I did not want to paddle again in July ever again. So I will need to go back and do the paddle from the San Juans to Whidbey, and at a time of year when maybe school's back in session, but I don't know that that's going to be, I'll find out. Anyway, so we went over to Whidbey, and because I had a ground crew and I could go where I needed to go when I needed to go there, from this point forward, I didn't do a contiguous line around Whidbey. I actually did Deception Pass later, but I'm going to do it. The presentation's going to be in a contiguous line. And I had 2 friends come up and paddle Deception Pass with me who had paddled it before. Con came and another friend. And we picked calm days and picked slack tide, and it was a fun trip. And the eddies were fun, and it was low key, and I want to go back and do it when it's not. now that I've had it in a smooth ride, now I want to go back and actually do some playing. But it was lovely, and then I paddled all of the inside of Whidbey Island, and then came around to the bottom of it, and then we took the ferry from Whidbey over to Port Townsend, and I paddled, this is of note. So when we got done paddling Deception Pass and Babs was on the shore, this immature cowbird decided that this is where it's going to take a bath and a nap. So it started out here on my paddle and was there for a few minutes, and then it hopped over onto my pump here and took about a 10-minute nap on my pump. So, yes, I thought it was kind of cool. So straight to San Juan de Fuca. So went over to Port Townsend and I paddled the entire stretch from Point Wilson. Point Wilson. That's Point Wilson there, right there. That's the easternmost tip. And then all the way west. This is a rhinoceros auklet and 2 common loons. Saw lots and lots of rhinoceros auklets. They're so cool. If you've never seen them, they have a little like rhino horn coming out of their head. They're really, really cool birds. Another interesting thing of note, and this was in the Daily News article that I did get to see, did not expect, is the entire breeding cycle of the marble murrelet. So starting up in Ketchikan, I actually got to see, the individuals starting to do the, hey, what's your name kind of thing. And then as I was coming down, I could see them paired up and just kind of hang out together and kind of lovey-dovey. And then for a while, they were gone. And I didn't see very many, if any. And if I did, they were immature. And then when I got down to the Strait of San Juan de Fuca, I started to see chicks out on the water. So I felt like I kind of got to see the whole life cycle. And of course, Strait of San Juan de Fuca and Cape Flattery, Nia Bay there was the last point at which I saw any marble murrelets. Everything south of there, I didn't see any. And so I got to take a quick note of the Elwha River. If everybody knows the story, they removed 2 of the dams, the 2 dams that were on the Elwha that were put in illegally. They were supposed to have fish ladders and they didn't, and that was actually in the plan that they were supposed to do it. They didn't do it, so they made them take them down. And they made them make it wild again. And it is a wild river again. And so I had never been there. And so the 3 of us, my ground crew and I, went up, and when we got there, the ranger said, well, you have to walk all the way up, and there's a new trail around the washout. The washout. He gets really excited. He says, yes, about a month ago, the wild river washed out the road. And because it's wild, we can't repair it. He was so happy about that. And so we did. We hiked up and we went up to the upper dam site. And I had to take these. Uncle couldn't do it. And I'm afraid of heights too. And then this is the valley where the lake was, where the reservoir was. And what's really cool about this shot is, of course, they planted hundreds of thousands of plants. But a lot of these up in this area here and over here are volunteers. And so it's coming back, the plant life is coming back so much faster than they planned. And the fish are coming back
so much sooner than they planned. And even the estuary, the mouth of the river, is bleeding out toward the hook in Port Angeles, and they think it'll meet up to it in the next couple of years, and it's far, far ahead of what they thought it would do. But what's really cool is it's like a ghost park up there. This is the parking lot at the upper dam site. And when we first were walking on it, we're like, what's all this stuff on the road? Why aren't they cleaning? Oh, they're not driving on the road. They can't drive on the road. So you're walking on these roads, these paved roads that are, but anyway, this is where the breach was. This is where it washed it out. And this is what you'd have to do to get across it. And it looks pretty benign here, but I wouldn't even take a 4x4 across it. And this was a nice day. I mean, so it's wild. It's doing its own thing and cutting its new courses, and it was just beautiful. And of course, as we were leaving, this immature downy woodpecker bade us goodbye. Yeah. So that I recommend going up there. It's so cool. So the last part was going around Cape Flattery, and Vern, one of the folks that I did the Deception Pass paddling with, came up and paddled around Cape Flattery because he had done it several times, and I hadn't. I selected the day and the time and to have the mildest trip possible, and it was just stunning. The day before, my uncle and I went out to the point and looked out, and it was blustering. I'm just like, oh my God, am I really going to do this? And then the day that we did it, the next day, it was calm, and you can see in the pictures, it was just beautiful, aquamarine and lovely. And Vern even said, he commented when we got off, he says, you really did a good job of planning this and having this was a walk in the park. I'd never had it be this easy. I was like, yes. So it was at this point that I made the very difficult decision to not do the Washington Coast solo. Technically, I could have done it. I have the chops. I know this. But I actually came to the place at this point where if I was going to do it again, I actually wanted to do it with somebody else. I wanted to have somebody else for safety, even if I could do it on my own. It was much more enjoyable to go around Cape Flattery with someone who'd done it before. So if I did get nervous about how I was going to navigate a certain channel through rocks, I just followed him because he'd done it before. Even if he hadn't done it before, somebody I can bounce it off and say, hey, what do you think about going this route and whatnot? Someday, yeah, maybe I'll do the Washington Coast solo, but I think for the first time I do it, I want to do it with somebody. And all of the memoirs, everything that I had read of people who had gone with multiple people, 2 or more people. So I decided, and not only that, I had a couple of personal things happening at home that were really calling me back, that I needed to come back. And I don't regret it. So I did come back for 2 weeks, a little less than 2 weeks, to wait for the tides that I had planned to cross the bar. And so I went back on August 29th. We camped out at Cape Disappointment and got up early in the morning to get the right tides. And I went out into the surf. Babs was a champ. In case you can't tell, that's me right there. That little dot up there is me on the last wave that went like this and like this. Actually, the one before it did that too. But it took me a while to get the nerve up to do it, even though I'd had all the surf training. And I'd been surfing on the trip, just not that kind of surf. But I finally said, okay, I think I've studied this long enough. And that's what they teach you when you learn to surf, is study it. Take as long as you need to study it. Learn, so you know what you're doing. And I did. I think it took an hour to get comfortable enough with it. And paddled over that, and it was big. It was Clapotis. It was going every way. The wind was going one way. The waves were going the other, and yet I was happy. I was having fun. I was like, this is great. Why was I even nervous about this? This is so much fun. And it took a left. I went out, paddled out probably half a mile, took a left, and then paddled over the bar. This is This is the bar from the Interpretive Center at Cape Disappointment, because it's really a good way to get an idea. It's right here's the North Jetty, and then here's the bar. There's the barge going out over it, and the South Jetty's over here. So I came around and I gave the jetty fair clearance because the water was wanting to push me into it. It had the wind at that point in time. And plus it's got some big ass eddies around it. So I gave it some distance and then came and crossed over the bar and looked to my right, looked to my left and saw the points of the jetties or the lines of the jetties. And I'm like, I'm crossing the Columbia Bar. And then there was a tug coming out over closer toward Astoria. I'm like, that tug's crossing the bar. We're both crossing the bar. This is great. Yeah, I'm doing it. And just as I came over the bar, humpback whale came up in the bay in front of me, just to kind of say, hey, welcome back home. You know, you're here. And continued on and paddled under the Astoria-Megler Bridge, which now has, they think, maybe up to 10,000 double-crested cormorants nesting under it. And last season it was 8,000, and the last number I saw, because they kicked them off of East Sand Island. And so now they're they're pooping all over the brand new paint job. Anyway, it was really cool though. You can see on these foundations that they're covered. They're just full of them. You can actually kind of see them in the photo. So afterward, I got as far as about even with quarantine station and had the current current change, and I was tired. So I got out at the beach at the quarantine station and called my uncle and said, I'm not going to make it as far as I thought I would tonight. I wanted to go to Rice Island, but it was calling for rain, and I hadn't packed my tent. Because I didn't have rain when I packed my tent in the forecast. And I was like, I am not sleeping in my sleeping bag in the rain. And I know it sounds soft, right? I was pretty hard by them, but I know it sounds really wimpy. But so I called him and said, let's go back to camp at Cape Disappointment, and then I'll come back to the quarantine station and launch from here. And he says, why don't we just stay at the quarantine station? And I was like, what? And I forgot, because he did the Lewis and Clark reenactment, and they're the sponsoring organization, nonprofit, for his reenactment group. So he just calls up Nancy, his friend, and says, hey, my niece is taking out here, can we camp here? You know, and you can sleep in either of the rooms, and use the kitchen, take a bath, you know, whatever. So I am proud to announce that I am the first person in 80 plus years to cross the bar, the Columbia Bar, and stay in the pest house of the quarantine station. Pretty cool, yeah. You know, everybody has their claim to fame. But it was fun. We had a good time. And then I got to launch from there in the morning, and I paddled down to a nice, easy, I'm back in my backyard paddle to Vista Park. Camped out at Vista Park that night, and then paddled home to Puget Island. I'm going under the Bernie Slough Bridge here. And Marty Vavudis, hi Marty if you're there, she paddled with me from Vista Park to Slowboat Farm. And got home, got Babs all washed up. Here she is outside the garage, and got emptied out and put her back in the garage, and I think I've taken her out once since then. But soon I'm going to have an expedition group, a coaching group that I'm going to do next month, and I'll pull her out for that. Where they want to learn how to plan an expedition. I think I can help them with that. But if you are interested in reading my daily blogs, you can go to KylieAustin.com, and they're all still there, including the ones since. And I think now is a good time to say thanks again to Friends of Skamokawa, and that's friendsofskamokawa.org. You can go and support them. And thanks Willapa Hills Audubon and Steve, and again, willapahillsaudubon.org, and donate button there. And most of all, thank you to everybody, especially my uncle and my dog, especially my friends and